Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yau, founder and president of the Pixel Project, and welcome to the first session in our Pixel Project Google Hangout series, featuring live Google Hangout sessions with activists, advocates, and experts from around the world. Today, the topic of today's session is bystanders and upstanders amid sexual violence, which is both timely and urgent in this age of Me Too and Time's Up, where the movement to end violence against women has reached another milestone. The public is not only starting to believe victims and hold rapists and other perpetrators of gender-based violence accountable, but also searching for ways to prevent and intervene when violence against women happens. One of the factors under general scrutiny and discussion now is the role bystanders can play in either stopping the violence or being complicit in it. So in light of this development, our guest tonight is Dr. Zachary D. Kaufman, whose forthcoming article on bystander behavior, protectors of predators of prey, bystanders and upstanders amid sexual violence, will be published in 2019 in the Southern California Law Review. So Dr. Kaufman is currently lecturer in law, Stanford Law School, and a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. He is a graduate of Yale University, where he was the student body president, the University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Yale Law and Policy Review. Dr. Kaufman has served in all three branches of the US government and in 3 international war crime tribunals. So in tonight's session, Dr. Kaufman will, 1, discuss his new article, The Bystanders' Role in Stopping Violence Against Women, as well as why and how we should prompt third parties to report the violence. And Dr. Kaufman will also answer questions live from the audience. So get your questions ready. You can type them into the chat box next to your screen, next to the screen on YouTube, where you're watching us right now. And our producer and chat box moderator, Anusha Kandasivam, who has probably greeted everyone by now there, will relay it to me to read out to Dr. Kaufman to answer. So basically, you have to log into YouTube. If you have a Google account, you will definitely be able to log into YouTube, because YouTube is part of Google's suite of applications and programs and tools. So if you haven't logged in yet, please log in. If you have any questions about Dr. Kaufman, what Dr. Kaufman and I will be discussing, just type them in there. Anusha, the moderator and producer, will relay the questions to me, and I will answer. I will read them out for Dr. Kaufman to answer. Now, how this is going to be set up is Dr. Kaufman will first give a short presentation about his paper. Then we'll move on to the discussion session. And after that, we'll have the Q&A, where I'll read out your questions. So if you think of any questions while listening to this session and watching Dr. Kaufman's presentation, just type them all out in the chat box. We will get to them. We will definitely get to them. We'll be here until 7 p.m. CST, so we have 55 minutes left. So let's get started. So now let's welcome Dr. Zachary D. Kaufman. Here we go. Hi, Dr. Kaufman.
Hello, Regina. Thank you so much to you and others in the Pixel Project for hosting me this evening to speak on this incredibly important topic of the Me Too movement and what role bystanders play in sexual violence. So, in the wake of widespread revelations about sexual crimes in the United States by Harvey Weinstein, Larry Nassar, and many others, this country is really reckoning with the past and searching for the means to prevent and punish such offenses in the future. And as we're increasingly learning, in many of these cases, third parties knew about the abuse and did not try to intervene, even by reporting the crime to law enforcement. So this new article that you mentioned that I've written and is forthcoming next year proposes a much more sort of comprehensive and aggressive approach to addressing these third parties who are aware of specific instances of sexual violence. And the purpose is really to try to align law a little more closely with morality. because morally, we think such third parties really should be more interventionist, and yet the law has certain limitations on prompting such. And so the article begins by providing an overview and assessment of what are called bad Samaritan laws. And these are statutes that impose a duty to assist others in peril and include various options. One is direct intervention, and another is reporting the emergency to law enforcement. And some bad Samaritan laws actually combine both into prompting both a duty to rescue and a duty to report. And such laws exist already in 11 US states and over 100 foreign countries. So drawing on historical research and trial transcripts and various interviews I conducted with prosecutors and judges and investigators and even some upstanders, the article then describes 4 prominent cases here in the United States involving witnesses to sexual violence. And the 4 cases, and I want to lay them out because we'll return to some of them, I'm sure, during this hour, are chronologically. First, the rape and murder of the 28-year-old Catherine, whose nickname was Kitty Genovese, on March 13, 1964 in Queens, New York. The second case is the gang rape of 21-year-old Cheryl Araujo on March 6, 1983 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The third is the rape and murder of 7-year-old Sharice Iverson in Prim, Nevada on May 25, 1997. And the fourth, the final one, is the rape of an unnamed 16-year-old girl in Steubenville, Ohio, the night of August 11 to 12, 2012. So the article goes into detail on each of these cases and provides insight into the range of conduct of various third parties, including both bystanders and upstanders. And while we're focusing in this conversation on bystanders, I also do want to stress that in 3 of the 4 cases, there were upstanders. There were people who did try to help to various levels of effectiveness. So because not all such witnesses are equal, I really realized that grouping them together under the general categories of bystanders and upstanders obscures distinct roles and duties and culpability for violating those duties. And so drawing on those 4 case studies that I just mentioned, the article presents a typology for describing bystanders and upstanders and divides bystanders into 6 subcategories and upstanders into 8 subcategories. And I do this to try to introduce greater nuance into these classifications, and also what I propose is a range of legal and moral responsibilities. And I also propose that this typology could be applied to lots of other situations beyond sexual crimes. The article also prescribes a kind of new approach to the duty to report on sexual violence and possibly other crimes and crises. And I base these recommendations on interviews I conducted with sexual violence prevention professionals, including Regina herself, as well as police, legislators, and social media policy counsel. And so the legal prescriptions, just to size them, and we can talk about them more in detail, concern strengthening, spreading, and standardizing duty to report laws at the state level, but also introducing them at the national level. And so as that applies here in the United States, I propose introducing what will be the first legal duty to report sexual crimes and possibly other offenses such as human trafficking at the federal level. And then various social prescriptions that I propose include raising public awareness of those duty to report laws because, of course, they're ineffective if they're unknown. And many people, even in the 11 states and in the various over 100 countries in which they currently exist, are completely unaware of them. And also I propose creating what I call upstander prizes or upstander commissions that would identify, honor, and reward upstanders, including for their efforts to mitigate sexual crimes. And so my overall hope with this article and with some follow-on articles is really to explore the idea that this combination of carrots and sticks may help stem the sexual violence epidemic. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Regina this evening and with speaking with all of you, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity to share my research and recommendations and to hear your own ideas. So thank you very much again for having me.
Hi. Well, thank you for coming on air with us. You are the inaugural. This is the inaugural, the first in hopefully many sessions with many advocates and activists. Working to end violence against women. So, over the past 2 decades, you have done extensive human rights work, including serving at 3 international war crime tribunals, the International Criminal Court, as well as the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and for the former Yugoslavia. So following that, why did you choose to focus on addressing violence against women in your new article?
Thank you very much, Regina, for that question. So, violence against women, of course, is a central concern in international human rights and international human rights law, including the 3 international war crimes tribunals in which I've been honored to serve. So, for example, the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was the first international court to clarify the definition of rape in international law and hold that it can constitute genocide. And so the Me Too movement really has shined a spotlight on violence against women and girls in the United States and how widespread it is. And so while much of my scholarship to date has focused on perpetrators of widespread crimes abroad, because of the Me Too movement, I felt incredibly compelled and inspired to focus this new article on examining the United States.
Yeah, and the United States, in a recent report by Reuters, the United States is pretty much the only Western country that is in the top 10 countries in the world for violence against women. So it's pretty timely that you're starting to focus on this. Yeah. So, violence against women is a complex human rights issue that affects so many different parts of society and takes so many different forms that no individual or organization can address all of it. So activists and advocates usually have to pick an aspect to focus on. What made you decide to focus on bystander behavior?
Thank you again for that great question, Regina. When the Me Too movement started, most people, activists, academics, and others were really focusing on perpetrators and survivors, and appropriately so. But as I have learned through my research, many crimes, especially those that are widespread, require indifference of or the facilitation by third parties. And so we soon learned that in many of these cases that were brought to light from the Me Too movement, third parties knew about the abuse and didn't try to do anything, even just to pick up the phone and call the police from the safety of their homes. And so I was motivated to scrutinize what others didn't seem to be paying as much attention to, and that was the third parties, the bystanders, and determine what we could do, if anything, to prompt would-be bystanders to act instead as upstanders.
Yeah, and some of these bystanders, especially like in the Larry Nassar case, I think last night or 2 nights ago, the Arthur Ashe Award was given to all the survivors who spoke up, and there's so many of them. And it took them about 15 to 20 years of collectively, speaking up to, they call it surviving together. And to finally put him away for life.
Yep.
Yeah, and
one thing that I think that's important to note about that case in particular, Regina, is many of these women and girls had already been trying to speak up for years, and they were not being believed. And law enforcement and various, Michigan State University weren't properly considering their reports. And so, part of what intrigues me so much about third parties, about bystanders, the people to whom, these women and girls were reporting and didn't do anything about it, and who otherwise knew about what Larry Nassar was doing and didn't say anything, is that if they had done something earlier, these third parties, maybe that would have mitigated or limited the huge impact on women and girls that Larry Nassar's crimes had. I mean, he committed crimes against hundreds, literally hundreds of women. And, the mind boggles at the possibility that if, more people to whom these women and girls were reporting had actually done something about it earlier, a lot of those crimes, I think, could have been avoided. And so, the Larry Nassar case, to me, really exemplifies the role that third parties play, because lots of people knew what was happening and didn't do anything about it.
Yeah, and and what breaks our heart is that some of the girls are now women said that their parents also didn't listen to them because they were minors at the time. Their parents didn't listen to them. Their parents didn't take, or their guardians did not take action. So something has to give. It's cultural, we think, to not listen to women, to sweep it under, our children. Women are children.
Well, and this is part of the reason why I think third-party reports can be so helpful. Precisely because, as you're saying, we know that women are so frequently disbelieved when reporting sexual violence. Having third parties report would help corroborate those instances. And so, skepticism would be met with corroborating evidence. And the hope would be that, more people coming forward would make the evidence so overwhelming that even skeptics would have to believe.
Yeah, the sad thing is that, really, we really should believe victims and survivors from the moment they tell their stories. But like the Bill Cosby case as well, it took 80-something women coming forward over the years, finally getting to what's the term for it? Finally getting to a point where it can't be ignored anymore.
Yeah.
And why should it take so many years and so many women in both the Nassar and the Cosby cases to actually finally get them to court to
Well,
find.
You're right, and of course it shouldn't. And so, when we start hearing reports from survivors themselves, let alone third parties, appropriate investigations should be conducted immediately.
Yeah. So, you begin your article with an overview and assessment of bad Samaritan laws and duty to report statutes in the US. So, do you think there will come a time when bystanders can be held legally responsible to report a rape or sexual assault with significant penalties if they do not do so?
So, where bad Samaritan laws exist, there are penalties, including fines and/or imprisonment. So, just as an example, in the U.S. state of Rhode Island, there's an existing duty to report law that imposes a maximum term of 6 months imprisonment and a fine of between $500 and $1,000 on individuals who witness sexual assault and fail to report it. But the problem is, only 11 states, as I mentioned, in the United States have such duty to report laws, and there really is no law as such at the federal level. And so I think the questions for us to consider are, will duty to report laws spread across the United States and abroad, and in which they don't already exist? As I mentioned, they do exist in about 100 foreign countries, but they're often not enforced where they even do exist. So how do you prompt such laws to spread, but also how do you prompt them to be enforced? And then the second question, I think, is, what really is the appropriate penalty for violating such a law? And, this is really a complicated question as I was really delving into it in my research. Part of what complicates it is the phenomenon in the US of what we call mass incarceration. So increasing the severity of these duty to report laws, you may have a disproportionate impact on certain communities, and it may add inmates to an already highly populated prison system. And so maybe you think that that's appropriate, but maybe you don't. And if you don't, maybe there are alternative penalties that would be more helpful. So one of the ideas that I've been researching is to propose some sort of a relevant community service. So for example, if a person failed to report a sexual assault, that person might be sentenced to serve in a sexual assault prevention and education center, for X number of hours. And I'd be really curious to hear what you think, Regina, and what other people who are participating in this Google Hangout think about what is appropriate. Should you have a financial penalty? Should there be probation or actually imprisonment? Or this kind of community service idea that I'm proposing, which I think would really be helpful in avoiding exacerbating the mass incarceration problem, while also, I think, contributing constructively to the actual issue at hand.
Yeah, perhaps it could depend on the severity of the attack that the bystander did not report. Gang rape, if you don't report it, I think, you should at least be financially penalized very heavily. But your idea of, getting them to do a very specific community service that also contributes to their education about rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, whatever they've witnessed, that's actually a pretty good idea, because a lot of people just sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to, I don't want to be a snitch, or they think it's normal, or they think it's not my business. And a lot of times it's because they are not familiar with the damage that, how criminal rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, and so on and so forth is. So education, I mean, this is what the Pixel Project does, right? We educate people, we provide materials for people, links, resources, we hold Google Hangouts such as this. But I think, well, can't speak for all advocates, all countries, but a good mix of education, fines, some of the, a whole mix of things, depending on the case, depending on the severity, but there should be guidelines. There really should be guidelines.
I agree with you that a lot of this should be case specific.
Yeah, and even if bystanders are made legally obligated to take action to stop the assault or report it to the relevant authorities, if the authorities do not take such reports seriously, like in the Brock Turner case where the judge is now being recalled, because he did not take it seriously, that was a joke. That sentence was a joke. But in these cases, what would you suggest bystanders can do if they're not being taken seriously either?
Well, so, as we've already been discussing, we already know that survivors of sexual violence, when they choose to report the crimes they've suffered, often face skepticism, and it's really one of the most horrifying and disappointing aspects of the revelations that we've learned through the Me Too movement. And a witness, as you're indicating, also may face similar doubt. But even if the witness is initially doubted, that person's testimony can really contribute substantial evidence to an investigation or prosecution. And if multiple witnesses report, then that evidence could overwhelm any doubt. And so what I would suggest is, just as survivors may choose to do so as well, witnesses, third parties, when they're deciding to report or being compelled to report, should really push the matter and not let it necessarily rest upon initial doubt.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, like in the Harvey Weinstein case, where his personal assistants and a lot of people who knew but who worked for his companies said that they couldn't say anything, their hands were tied, because in the employment contracts, there's a sort of a gag order. One of the clauses is a gag order, they can't talk about it. Well, I mean, what are your views on that sort of preemptive gagging of potential witnesses? What do you think should be done in that?
I know that other legal scholars are looking at the question of what gag orders should and should not do. So, one question is, should gag orders prohibit anyone from reporting criminality? And there are, I guess, are different views on that matter, and other legal scholars, fortunately, are interrogating that matter. But from it seems like a convenient justification, of course, for not reporting. And I think it really does come down to each and every one of us to decide, what limits we're going to accept in these truly outrageous situations. Do we accept that others would, perhaps fire us if we're going to report criminality, or something else? And if we aren't, if we aren't willing to accept those limitations, then we may be trying to help the problem rather than enabling it. I mean, part of why Harvey Weinstein was able to do all of the things that he did was because of this code of silence. And I document in my article that at least 16 people knew about his conduct, and it was widely known throughout the Weinstein Company and Miramax. And a lot of people were either afraid or unwilling, or felt somehow prohibited from reporting. But I think we need to look at all of the reasons why people are motivated not to report, interrogate each one of them, and try to find ways to enable people to report when they feel otherwise they can't. So these contracts, I think, are highly problematic, and we need to look at that.
All right. So everyone, I see all you out there. Quite a few of you have joined us. Welcome if you've just joined us. If you have any questions for Dr. Kaufman, please type them into the chat box next to the YouTube screen. Anusha, who's today's moderator, will send them over to me, and I will read them out for Dr. Kaufman to answer. So if you have any questions, please send them in now. We're almost halfway through the session. And so let's get back to our discussion, Dr. Kaufman. In the violence against women movement, so we're going back to, you mentioned, we talked about the difficulty of victims being believed when they report the crimes. In cases of rape and sexual assault. So in the violence against women movement, we take victim and survivor confidentiality seriously. Some activists and advocates may object to laws that obligate individual bystanders to report sexual assault and rape because the victim may not want any further action to be taken, or there may be a danger of retaliation, which is quite, in many cultures, there's a very high probability of social retaliation. What are your thoughts on reconciling requirements for reporting the crime and the needs of the victim, particularly since most societies still treat victims and survivors atrociously?
So thank you, Regina. And, I really credit you with informing my thinking on this issue during a conversation we had while I was conducting research for this article. And as we know, as you're pointing out, sexual violence survivors sometimes do prefer to keep such crimes private, whether out of the fear of the retaliation that you're mentioning, or for other reasons, such as a belief that police wouldn't or couldn't help, and other reasons as well. And so, as you know, some activists and advocates argue that we should defer, of course, to adult survivors. And I want to stress adult survivors' wishes, out of respect, or to protect their privacy, or to promote a culture in which survivors feel that they can confide in others. And so in the article, I propose what I call confidants, as being a subcategory of bystanders that would be excused from legal duties to report. So confidants are witnesses whom an adult sexual assault victim has asked not to report the crime. And so I would propose that bad Samaritan laws either be amended, or when they're introduced in the first place, it be included that confidants be carved out from those who are legally required to report. I also have some other carve-outs to the category of people who would be legally required to report, but confidants are certainly one of them.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next section of your article. In your article, you examined you mentioned that earlier in the session, 4 very famous cases of bystander behavior in sexual assault and rape cases across the decades. That's what's interesting about your article. You did not just pull cases from that sparked off the Me Too movement. You went as far back as, I think, the 1960s. Is it
Yes.
the 1960s? Well, the Kitty Genovese case, which for everyone listening in, the Kitty Genovese case is so famous that even today, we use the term the Kitty Genovese effect to describe bystanders who just freeze and don't take any action. And you literally went from the 1960s and right up to the 21st century with the Steubenville case that shone a spotlight on this on social media, because now people are posting recordings of gang rapes, recordings of sexual assault on YouTube, on Facebook, to share with their friends. Sending them through WhatsApp, sending them. Yeah. I'm not gonna cuss and swear on on this session, but it is becoming. It is a huge issue. So through your anyway, getting back to this, through your research, have you observed any fundamental changes in bystander behavior through the decades when it comes to cases of violence against women?
So thank you. This is a really important question, Regina. Thank you for asking it, and thank you also for mentioning the first case of the 4 that I focused on, the Kitty Genovese case. I started with I wanted to focus on these 4 cases, and because we still actually don't know enough about the current cases, everything about the Larry Nassar case, the Harvey Weinstein case, and so forth. We don't know about who all bystanders were, and so while more information is coming out about those cases, I wanted to look back historically where there was more information available, so I could really dive deeply into the full range of conduct in a few particular cases. So the fundamental change that I think has come really is exactly related to what you just brought up regarding social media. So the fundamental change is, in many ways, the digital age. And so, with the advent of social media and mobile devices, texting and WhatsApp and so forth, information about crimes and crises is sometimes transmitted over these platforms in real time or shortly thereafter. And so, for example, and part of the reason why I picked the Steubenville case in particular was precisely to draw out this phenomenon. So several people in that case who weren't even physically present became aware of the sexual assault contemporaneously or near contemporaneously through texting and social media, and like the people who were physically present, didn't do anything about it. Actually, and one of the cases even made a YouTube video of his own mocking the victim. It was a 12-minute YouTube video. It's actually still available on YouTube. And so social media and mobile devices have produced a few different but related changes regarding bystander behavior. So, first, relating to the Steubenville case, these devices and social media have been and can be used to document crimes and crises, including sexual violence, to be shared and viewed either later or even while they occur. And so second, these devices and media have reduced both the burden on and the risk to witnesses in reporting emergencies. So one of the carve-outs for a duty to report would be, you shouldn't be obligated legally to report if it would imperil yourself, and this is common to all bad Samaritan laws. But if you're in a further remove, so off-site, not physically present from the crisis, the sexual violence in this case, in many ways that reduces risk yourself to report, to call law enforcement. And then so finally, mobile devices and social media have been used and can be used to document the presence and conduct of witnesses themselves, including whether any of them, are either passively or actively encouraging or enabling the perpetrators. There have been cases where, digitized information about a crime or a crisis have actually shown that other people, third parties, were present and were either coaxing on the perpetrator or were just choosing not to do anything. So it provides more evidence of this bystanderism. And so in short, these technological advancements are increasing awareness of emergencies, while they're also decreasing justification for not reporting them, and they're strengthening evidence of witnesses and their conduct.
If the attacks are documented on social media, are they admissible in the court of law?
That depends on a number of factors. I think that that might be beyond the scope of this particular conversation, but I mean there are a whole host of evidentiary factors that that determine whether social media information is admissible in court, and it depends on the court. It depends on if it's the U.S. or foreign court. There's lots of factors at play. I mean, yeah. but it could be. And so the important thing, here for what we're talking about is more and more of this sort of potential evidence is emerging and could be used both to, as evidence of the crime, the underlying crime, the sexual violence, or evidence of bystanderism.
Yeah, I was asking that because if someone doesn't believe you and then you have video evidence, it might help when you report stuff, when you report attacks. Let's go back to what you mentioned earlier in your overview of your paper. The most interesting feature of your report, by the way, is how you break down bystanders into a typology. And this is something that hasn't been done before as far as we know. So what do you hope to achieve by breaking down bystanders by type?
Great. Well, let me just pull up a chart that I've developed on this topic so that everybody can be literally, I guess, on the same page. Can we see that? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, great. Great. So, the issue that I was sort of confronting is that most commentators, when they're describing witnesses to sexual violence and other crimes, just refer to them, generally speaking, as bystanders. But, as I was studying these 4 cases and some others, I really realized that there's a wide range of conduct of such individuals. And so drawing on the cases that I analyzed, I developed this typology on bystanders, but also on upstanders that introduces, I think, greater nuance into these categories so that we can better understand, what the full range of conduct is, and then the corresponding legal and moral responsibilities in those cases are. And so if we just sort of look through the chart, I'll just run through this. I propose dividing both bystanders and upstanders into both third parties and fourth parties, especially in the digital age. So I call third parties those that are physically present, and fourth parties those that are not physically present. And the reason I divide them is because we may think of them differently, or actually we may think of them the same when we're considering what roles and responsibilities witnesses have when they're either viewing a sexual crime in person or through, for example, Facebook or Skype. Then if we go down the chart to bystanders, I've divided this into 6 subcategories. So innocent bystanders are those that reasonably don't actually understand what the situation is. You mentioned the Kitty Genovese case. So in that case, it was in the middle of the night, and the sight lines were in the apartment complex obscured some of what was happening. And it may very well be the case that some of the 37 or 38, depending on which report you believe, of the people who were in the area at the time, Kitty Genovese's neighbors. some of them very well may not have actually understood what was happening. And so they might be innocent bystanders, for example. Excused bystanders are those who are excused for some sort of reason, reasonable justification for not reporting or otherwise intervening. And I subdivide this into endangered bystanders and confidants. We've already talked about confidants. I believe, for the reasons that we've discussed, that people who are witnesses or who are asked by an adult survivor not to report should be excused from doing so for the reasons we've already discussed. Also, as common as I already mentioned to bad Samaritan laws, those who sincerely fear for their own well-being, if they somehow intervene by reporting or otherwise becoming involved, those people should also be excused, and that's standard for bad Samaritan laws. That then brings us to the morally reprehensible and legally, I think, reprehensible categories of unexcused bystanders and the subcategory of enablers. So the unexcused bystanders are the opposite of innocent and excused bystanders. They correctly perceive what's going on. They don't fear for their well-being, and nobody asks them not to report it. And so there is no valid justification for not reporting. And then the most morally reprehensible and legally reprehensible of this category of unexcused bystanders is this kind of subcategory of enablers. And those people are willfully ignorant of the situation, correctly perceive it, and deliberately act against the victim's interests. And so, one person I would highlight in this case, relating to the case studies that appear in this article, is David Cash in the case of the Sharice Iverson rape and murder in Nevada. So he was the friend of the perpetrator, Jason Strohmeyer, and he stood outside of a bathroom after he knew that Jason Strohmeyer had abducted 7-year-old Sharice Iverson and had already started assaulting her. He witnessed the first several minutes of that assault. He stood outside the bathroom. At that point, could have, of course, told security or called the police, chose not to. And afterward, and he might have very well been standing guard, for all we know, to prevent anybody from entering. And then after the assault was complete and Jason Strohmeyer had molested and murdered Sharice Iverson, he spoke with Jason Strohmeyer as Jason emerged from the bathroom. Jason told him exactly what he did. And at that point, David Cash did two things. He suggested that Jason Strohmeyer develop a false alibi to cover the time and his whereabouts during that crime. And also he encouraged him to flee the country. And that seems much more, these actions of standing outside the bathroom, of encouraging Jason Strohmeyer to flee and develop a false alibi, that goes, in my view, way beyond, well beyond a mere innocent bystander. And so I think it is very helpful when we're thinking about what laws should apply to certain individuals in certain circumstances, what bad Samaritan laws should apply, to develop a wider range in our understanding of what the different types of bystanders are. And so that's why I've developed this particular typology to really try to inform our understanding of these different contexts so that we can then decide what laws to apply. And in the case of unexcused bystanders and their subset of enablers, I think those are the ones to whom we should apply bad Samaritan laws. But I would go further in saying that in the case of enablers, like David Cash, I would argue, we should think about applying other crimes as well. For example, accomplice liability, as it seems to me at least that David Cash went well beyond being a mere bystander.
Yeah. So, in the final section of your article, by the way, everyone who's listening, if you have any questions, we're moving into the final 15 minutes of this session. So if you have any questions, do leave them with Anusha in the chat box next to the screen, and we will read them out for Dr. Kaufman to answer. Let's move on to the final section of your article. So you advocate for a carrot and stick approach to transforming bystanders into upstanders through various legal and social prescriptions. Do you think there should be an equal amount of carrot and stick, or that one should be emphasized over the other?
That's a really interesting and important question, Regina. You know, we know from psychology that some people respond better to carrots while others respond better to sticks. And so, you know, I would propose that we pursue both carrots and sticks in the hope that one prompts would-be bystanders to act as upstanders where the other doesn't. And you know, I would note that such carrots and sticks aren't just prospective instruments. They're not just to, I think, prompt certain behavior. I think they're also retrospective tools. And so, you know, even if bad Samaritan laws don't motivate would-be bystanders to act as upstanders, I think we should still consider strengthening and spreading them to express society's objection to bystander behavior and perhaps to punish it. And even if they don't motivate would-be bystanders to act as upstanders, I think we should also still consider rewarding upstanders as an appreciative gesture for their conduct. And so I don't know the exact, you know, kind of combination or amount of carrot and stick that's necessary. It probably also, you know, varies per culture. But I think it's worth at least pursuing both and seeing you know, which make a difference in certain cases and with certain types of people.
Yeah, and speaking of variations by culture, do you think the ideas that you presented would only work in the US context, or do you think they could be applied effectively across different cultures?
You know, that's another fascinating question. You know, just as people within the US are so diverse and thus respond differently probably to carrots and sticks, people around the world are also diverse and I'm sure respond differently to various prompts as well. And so, you know, in my future research, I'll conduct empirical analyses of my ideas to see how effective they can be in different contexts, and maybe that will help shine more of a light on this question.
Yeah. And, you know, male violence is at the root of the vast majority of rape and sexual assault cases. And in at least 2 of the case studies you've examined, men and boys who witnessed the rape or sexual assault have been complicit in either turning a blind eye to the crime, egging on the perpetrator, or participating in the assault themselves. So besides the prescriptions laid out in your article, what do you think we can do to get men to become upstanders when they witness violence against women?
So, you know, I argue that in at least actually 3 of the 4 case studies I examined involving Cheryl Rajo, Sharice Iverson, and the unnamed victim in the Steubenville rape case, I think it's pretty clear that men and boys who were aware of the sexual assault were complicit in some way. So I think actually the majority of the cases in these 4 situations. You know, we have lots of work to do. So, you know, first, we need to educate the public on what actions constitute sexual violence. And, you know, here's where the Pixel Project and other advocacy organizations and educational organizations can be so helpful. You know, truthfully or not, one witness in the Steubenville case claimed that he didn't know that digital penetration can qualify as sexual violence. And in Ohio, where this case occurred, that does constitute rape. And he at least claimed to be unaware. And whether or not we believe him, I think it's clear that we do need to educate more people about what qualifies as sexual violence. Second, I think we need to do a better job as parents, as educators, as activists, religious leaders, and others in promoting empathy, particularly for strangers. In the Iverson case that I was just describing about David Cash and Jason Strohmeyer, the bystander, David Cash, when asked later about why he didn't report his friend Jason Strohmeyer for the atrocity he had just committed against Sharice Iverson, he expressed care for his friend, the perpetrator, Jason, but none at all for the victim, Sharice Iverson. And he explained his lack of care for her as saying that he didn't know her. And so clearly there's an empathy gap here. And, you know, it's possible that people who lack such empathy can't be inspired to adopt it. Maybe there's something fundamentally wrong, perhaps sociopathic, about someone like David Cash. But my understanding is that there are certain techniques that can be used to try to promote greater empathy, especially among children. And I think that that is worth pursuing. And then third, I think we all need to do a better job communicating ideal upstander behavior so that people know what they should do and maybe even can do if they find themselves witnessing sexual violence. So implementing the carrots and sticks I described, people don't know or understand what they should do in these contexts. And so part of the reason why I'm so interested in popularizing upstander behavior is to give examples to society of ideal conduct that can be emulated and should be emulated.
Yeah. Now, let's move over to questions from the audience. Guys, we have, if you're listening in right now, if you're watching this right now, we have about 8 to 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the questions. If you have any questions, now is sort of your last opportunity to type in your questions to get asked. So we have questions from Anusha herself. She said, she asked, introducing these laws and policies is great, but how do you propose getting authorities to enforce the law when even at this point, cooperation from authorities and conviction or proper sentencing is so poor?
That's a great question, Anushma. And part of the reason why I think it's such a great question is because we already have some of these bad Samaritan laws, including duty to report laws, on the books, again, in about 11 states in the US and in about 100 foreign countries, and many of them are just not being enforced. So part of the challenge, I think, is I think a lot of law enforcement aren't even aware of these laws. So popularizing them, and this is perhaps part of the role that activists and other advocates can play, raising public awareness, both for law enforcement, which obviously should already be aware of these laws, but also for the public, so that the public understands that they could be held accountable under these laws. And so, I think this is partly a public awareness campaign. And it isn't enough, as you're alluding to, that the laws be introduced, but also that they be enforced. Although I would say one caution about that I've uncovered in my research. So I wouldn't say that the true effectiveness of these laws is only measured by direct enforcement. In other words, the effectiveness of these laws isn't only measured, I think, by charging bystanders with a violation of the law. There's another strategy to these laws, and it has indeed been used. And so this strategy is that if the law exists in a particular context, investigators, prosecutors can use it in a sort of striking a deal with witnesses. So they could offer not to charge a violation of a duty to report if the witness agrees to testify against the perpetrator. And so some prosecutors have told me that in their estimation, it's a higher priority to get the conviction of the underlying sexual violence than the conviction of the violation of the duty to report. And so they sometimes will choose to use a threat of charging the law in exchange for eliciting testimony. And so it's hard to measure how often this is happening. It's one of the challenges I've been finding in my research to determine just how effective these laws are, because as I've determined, it's not the effectiveness isn't, in my view, just the charging. And if it were, it'd be easier to measure that. But the backroom conversations and deals that are struck is, in my view, another measure of the effectiveness of these laws.
Yeah. And another question from Anusha. She says, are you working with any authorities or policymakers in relation to your research or making the laws you propose a reality?
Yes, I am, and I'm not at liberty to discuss that at the moment, but yes, I'm very interested and actively engaged in conversations with legislators about introducing and spreading and standardizing the laws that I discuss in the article.
Yeah. Do you think at some point there would be federal level Bad Samaritan laws that apply to everybody in the U.S.?
So one of the proposals in the article is indeed exactly that, to introduce what would be the first federal general duty to report on sexual crimes and perhaps other crimes and crises. And I have recently had a meeting in DC on Capitol Hill with a legislator who is interested in pursuing that idea, a senator.
Okay. Well, fingers crossed that whoever the senator is can get it pushed through, especially in today's political climate. So we're coming up to 7 p.m. PST. So do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up, Dr. Kaufman?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much again to you, Regina, to Nushma, to everybody else in this Google Hangout who is participating now or who sees this later, for your interest and engagement in this issue. It's too important for us not to try to think creatively and constructively about sexual violence. Clearly, what the traditional approaches of criminalizing sexual violence and calling on men and boys to act voluntarily as upstanders have proven insufficient. So I'm trying to think creatively and constructively, and I want to urge everybody else to think creatively and constructively about what more we can do. At the same time, while we're innovating in this area, I want us to consider, unintended consequences. We've already talked about the possibility of exacerbating mass incarceration. I want to raise a second issue, and that is one of false reporting. So we now know in the United States that false reporting, which seems more and more common, is a problem here in this country, and I know other places as well. It's sometimes motivated by racism and sometimes by classism and other discrimination, and sometimes it can be fatal. And so duty to report laws, if they became more prevalent, could increase the amount of intentionally or accidentally incorrect calls to police. And malicious or benevolent individuals could try to invoke these statutes to claim that they were only following the law and expressing a supposedly genuine concern. On the other hand, I would just note that false reporting to police is a federal and a state crime, and so to try to deal with and to preempt this possibility of more false reporting, law enforcement could raise public awareness about the offense and its penalties, and prosecutors could more consistently charge violators to try to promote deterrence. And so while false reporting is a serious concern, I think there are ways to address it, and we just all need to be cognizant of these and other unintended consequences. So, thank you very much for everybody's interest and engagement on this issue. And again, thank you most of all to Regina, Nishma, and the Pixel Project.
All right, so I'm going to put myself back on screen. Now, thank you so much for tonight's session, thought-provoking discussion, Dr. Kaufman. And like Dr. Kaufman says, thank you all so much for joining us today for this discussion about bystander behavior. Now, to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. We will also be sharing the link to Dr. Kaufman's article through Twitter and Facebook and all our platforms. It's free to download, so have a look, go download, have a read. There are lots of ideas that we haven't had time to discuss during this session. And thank you all so much again, and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world. Follow us on Facebook and on Twitter to find out about our next Google Hangout sessions. This is Regina signing out. It's time to stop violence against women.